6 or 7 of us here tonight, and we're here to present 2 important documents and issues. The first being this book, Sanctions, A Wrecking Ball in the Global Economy. And we have one of the, many of us are authors, but the woman beside me, Judy Bellow, is one of the people who put it together with Sarah Flounders. And the second issue we're going to discuss tonight is the Sanctions Tribunal. And we have the program of the hearings of the Sanctions Tribunal, and I will address that, as will Charlotte Cates, following the first presentation from Judy Bellow. So what I'll do now is I will present Judy Bellow very briefly, and she will describe the book, the process, and some of the issues, after which there will be a short video from Sarah Flounders about the Sanctions Kill book. And then there will be a presentation of the Sanctions Tribunal, and then I will follow up with several different issues, including the importance of fighting sanctions in Canada. So at my left is Judy Bellow, and Judy is a close collaborator with Sanctions Kill. She is very active in many organizations, including the Syrian Support Movement, United Anti-War Coalition, Sanctions Kill, and several other organizations. She's a web designer and a person with a long experience in solidarity with respect to I like the term Global South, better than Third World, but that's a choice, all right? So I'm really pleased to present at my left, Judy Bellow, who will present the book, and after we can ask questions either of her or of me. Thank you. Go ahead, Judy, please.
Okay, thank you very much. And can you start the slideshow, Malcolm? Or Marcus, excuse me. Oh, Malcolm. I had it right the first time. All right. So basically, okay. Basically, this is just to introduce the book. Below are links to some of the organizations that I'm affiliated with and that the book is affiliated with, but not so much the organizations in Canada, which I think that Karen will fill you in on later. The book is a 200-page anthology, and it has close to 30 authors at all levels. There's different, there are some people are activists, some people are academics, some people live in sanctioned countries and are talking about their own experiences. Others are people reporting on sanctions from a global perspective. So that's just a brief introduction to the book, and you could go on to the next slide, Malcolm. Thank you. Okay, we'll pass the first one because that's just my bio. And so I wanted to start out with just a brief introduction to sanctions. Most of you probably have some idea how sanctions work, but I'm just going to sort of review it. So sanctions are a form of warfare. They're a form of economic warfare, usually associated with violent warfare at the same time. They are a contemporary form of siege warfare. And so if you've ever seen a military or a medieval film, you know, you see the army encamped around the walls of the city, and they basically have a choice. They can either let the army in to rape and pillage, or they could starve to death. And that is essentially what sanctions are in today's world. So sanctions target civilians. So they are illegal under international law. They are illegal under the law of the United Nations, because they target the sovereignty of countries. You know, they're one country targeting another. They're from warfare. But they're also illegal under international law prior to the United Nations. Around the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century, there were the Geneva Conventions, and it is against international law to target civilians in any way. It's against international law to target soldiers when they take off their uniform and lay down their gun. It's against the law to target prisoners. So all of this foundation is violated by sanctions. Next slide. So there's a different ways that they're implemented. The simplest way is a trade embargo. So they're going to say that, so they're going to say that, you know, one country will say that you can't, no one can trade in certain things with you. So it might be, well, usually they say military equipment. Everybody goes, oh, good, yeah, we're not going to trade military equipment with them. No problem. But then, of course, when you start to go down to the nitty gritty and you start to deal with fine parts, machinery, and chemicals, the things that are used in military equipment and the things that are used to build weapons are the same things you use to build medical supplies. They're the same things you use to build, you know, functioning infrastructure in a country. So that's the initial attack usually. And then the United States and the G9 or however many they are right now, the Western powers, control something called the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. And that's a mouthful, but you've probably heard of SWIFT. And that's the acronym SWIFT. And so SWIFT is the network of pathways through which money travels internationally. And there's no way for money to move, at least up to this point. This is changing, but for most of the last century, there's no way for money to move from one country to another except through the SWIFT system. So if you control the SWIFT system, you can shut a country down by, first, you could say enforce trade embargoes that way. You could enforce the flow of money in terms of details, or you can, as has been done with Syria and Russia and Iran and North Korea, I think are the big ones. Oh, Eritrea also, that where they turn them out of the SWIFT system. And if they're not in the SWIFT system, then they have absolutely no way to move money in and out across their borders. So there are something called secondhand sanctions, which double down on the basic sanctions. And that says that any corporation or country or individual that trades with a sanctioned country or provides any kind of charitable relief to them will also be sanctioned. And so they can use massive fines. And I think the biggest example I know of is Deutsche Bank has paid some major fines for violating sanctions, for having their customers violate sanctions, not for themselves doing it. But so the banks are very wary, because if one of your customers violates the sanctions using your port on the SWIFT system, then what they do is they tie it to you. And so that's another way that sanctions are enforced. Finally, another way that they can sanction a country is through outright theft of assets and cash. I think it's notorious that they just took something like $500 billion from Russia and $8 billion from Afghanistan. Talk about taking food from the mouths of hungry children. And there are many other countries, Venezuela, Cuba, that have had their assets frozen. They call it frozen. What basically it is stolen. So, and Iran, I think, was the first country they did that too. But in any case, the reason they can do this, you might wonder, like, why does anybody have their money out there? But countries have kind of a slush fund in the global banking system. kind of like you have a checking account, but if you want overdraft protection, then you have to have a savings account to back it up that has some money in it. So if you have that savings account, it has to be sitting in a Western bank. It has to be sitting in a bank that's at the heart of SWIFT. And so that money is available for any Western bank and for the United States Federal Reserve to at any time abduct it or freeze it, as they like to say. So there's money in Iran that's been frozen for decades. And they can also steal your assets. So the United States, Venezuela had Citgo on American Caribbean islands, and that's their refinery for their oil business. So the United States stole Citgo and all of their equipment from Venezuela. They didn't have to do that for Iran because in Iran, they bombed all of their equipment during the Iran-Iraq war. So there are many ways in which sanctions can be enforced. And so I just want to talk, this is my last little section here, but so one of the main things they say is chronic, chaotic hyperinflation. And sometimes, you know, they use big abstract terms, but what does that really mean to the people in the country? What it means is that their money has no value, and that their government's money has no value, and that the government cannot import anything, even if they could pass the trade embargo, because their money has no value. And I learned this the hard way. I was in Iraq, I don't know, more than a decade ago, and I had a bunch of money, and I went out just to Lebanon, and I couldn't cash it in. I couldn't turn it back to dollars. So I just brought it home and gave it to my nephew to play with, to a child, because it was worthless. So that's one of the things. So that's a top level result of sanctions. At the next level, broken infrastructure means that water purification isn't available, transportation isn't available, power plants are broken down, and so there's no power for people in Syria right now. And I do use that a lot as an example because I've been there several times recently. In Syria, I think there's 2 hours a day of electricity in most places. And they just had this terrible earthquake. And well, what if you need a surgery? What if you got injured? Well, there's no antibiotics and there's no painkillers. And Syria used to make these things for themselves, and now they no longer can get the raw materials to create them from. And they can't import them either because their money has no value. So that is an example of broken infrastructure. And we've all seen it in Iraq too. They use the war to destroy as much as possible, and then they won't allow, basically the sanctions block them from restoring it. Factories are shut down. You can't manufacture without raw materials. Your machines have to keep working. Obviously, there's no exports then, and you can't import anything because you have no money. So there's chronic shortages of food, medicine, energy. Children get sick and die from bad water. Elderly people, the median age that people live to drops down, and it moves into the 50s from out of the 70s. As in most of like our countries in Canada and the United States. So you don't expect to live very long. If you get sick, you are highly, you may not be able to get care, even in a country that has medical care for all. You can't get care because they don't have it. And so this leads to disease and poverty and desperation. The schools are shut down, so it leads to ignorance. And then my last point, regional and global financial instability. We move on to my next slide, and I'll try and go through this really quickly. Go forward too, Malcolm. So now what about the sanctions on Russia and China? Well, it's a new ball game. Russia has food, they have gas and oil, they have more wheat than most countries, they have technology, better technology than the United States, they have a lot of raw materials. Same with China, they have pretty much everything they need except maybe oil. They have good relationships with the decolonized developing world, or the global south, as John likes to call it. And so nobody's paying any attention to the sanctions on Russia. And as far as the sanctions on China go, I mean, next time you go to Walmart or to any department store, look around on the shelves and think to yourself about how much of the stuff would be absent if we had a complete embargo on China. Think of how many of the computer brands wouldn't be there anymore. How many of the how much of the clothes and the toys, everything. So this is boomerang. It's coming back on us this time, and Europe is devastated. Europe has no access to reasonably priced oil and gas. They are their manufacturing is again just like the sanctioned countries. It's being shut down because they're shut out from their resources, which are on the other side of the sanctions line. It's become a line of demarcation rather than the siege is working the other way. We're actually sieging ourselves and leaving the rest of the world free to move on. So that's the new world. And Russia and China are very carefully and deliberately forming the hub of a new global economic entity. And I think over the next decade or so, we're going to see really major changes here and there. So that's what I have to say for now. And I'd like to show the video there. I'll introduce it. Aside from the book, right before we produced the book, Sarah and Li Suhin, a Chinese activist who's a friend of ours, prepared a video called Vaccine and Sanctions, where they talk about how the vaccines were sanctioned in large parts of the global south, were unable to get vaccines. And from there, they go on to talk in depth about sanctions. And so this is a great introduction to the book and also to the video that we're talking about. We have copies of both on that table over there. And go for it, Malcolm. Thank you.
In the days since the pandemic has ebbed back in national attention, we have very consciously moved forward with a campaign against U.S. use of sanctions. But even this has now changed globally. The war in the Ukraine, the brutal NATO expansion into the Ukraine, the arming and weaponizing of the people in Ukraine, the firing on the Russian population in Ukraine, all of this created a crisis that could not be avoided.
According to Sanction Kills, an international campaign organized by many peace and justice organizations and activists, including Sarah Flounders, Margaret Flowers, and Li Suhin, who criticized Western countries using sanctions as weapons against the world. Sanctions are essentially the imposition of arbitrary measures creating inhumane economic hardship on a targeted country. Sanctions from the United States affected a third of the world's population, imposing more than 8,000 measures on more than 40 countries. Economic sanctions are also known as embargoes.
The U.S. effort to impose and to get all of the European Union and Britain to go along with the sanctions was to cut the trade relations with Russia. A very different thing happened, though, and that is the rest of the world refused to go along with U.S. sanctions because they were still able to trade with China and have economic relations and exchange. And so sanctions on Russia and now new, even extensive sanctions on China are not succeeding. The people of the world increasingly are deciding to do what is in their own interests. They have a population to feed and they need food, fertilizer, technology, And they can't get that from the West except by onerous conditions that are an assault on their sovereignty. So we have produced a new book, which is an anthology looking at the both difference that exists now and also looking at sanctions as a weapon that is used again and again against. There's a whole study of the impact of US and UN sanctions on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, on Iran, on still today the continuing sanctions on Syria, and so on. But the more than 40 countries is a real theme that we take. The number of countries that are impacted affects a whole economy regionally. So we're trying to explain this to working people here, that these sanctions come back, they boomerang onto the economy here with increasing inflation, recession that really people are coping with, in the layoffs, and in an intensely fragile economy.
Sanctions, a wrecking ball in a global economy, is a book with several dozen writers, include Sarah Flanders, Margaret Flowers, and me. Comprehensive analysis against Western sanctions against other countries. The impact of sanctions on more than 40 developing and formerly colonized countries, countries 1/3 of the world population, was barely discussed in mainstream media for decades.
I'm just going to interrupt if we can, because the video's still not up.
Africa to discuss the devastated impact of US sanctions on other regions. With Margaret Flowers wrote Sanctions Kill Toolkit to understand the history of the US sanctions and why we need to be against it.
I think a necessity for the workers' movement in the US to explain to working people that racism, that bigotry, that attacks on another country are not in their own interests. And this really helps to combat also the anti-China sentiment that is being consciously whipped up every single day by the media. It's used to justify the new rounds of sanctions on China, whether it's in chips or whether it is in cotton from Xinjiang. Every form of US policy is to intensify and to justify sanctions. And we feel that this has to be combated within the United States. This has to be explained again and again. The books are one way, the webinars are another, the demonstrations and rallies are still another. But it's important for working people to have their own voice in this, and not only the voice of corporate power.
I'm just going to interrupt for the audience on the Zoom. We were not able to see most of the video. I'm sure you were working on it, but we'll have to look at what we do with the video with Charlotte Kate. So I'll just leave that with those in Montreal in the room. We could hear the video well, but the picture disappeared on us and we couldn't seem to get contact to know that we needed to get it back up. So sorry to the audience watching on Zoom, but we will put the video up separately after as well.
I would like to now present Charlotte Cates. And Charlotte Cates is the co-president of the Sanctions Tribunal. And she will now, we're providing a video of Charlotte Cates right now, and thank you very much. And then I will come back and speak about this.
Yeah, let's done.
This is right.
We do have video, so just we'll watch and make sure the video stays as we start, even if we have to back it up.
Doesn't work out with presenting.
Hello, my name is Charlotte Caves. I'm a member of the steering committee of the International People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism, sanctions, blockades, coercive economic measures. I'm also the international coordinator of Sami-Dune Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, a co-sponsor of the tribunal, and an active member of the National Lawyers Guild and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, two organizations that are also co-sponsors of the tribunal and which are working diligently to advance the same perspectives, views, and goals of the tribunal in the legal community in the United States and internationally. The goal of the tribunal is to provide a basis for meaningful legal action to hold the United States, its officials, and its complicit allies, including Canada, accountable for the harms that are done around the world by the ongoing and repeated practice of sanctions against a massive portion of the global population. The tribunal views sanctions not only as a mechanism of warfare waged against countries particularly by the imperial core powers, but also as a mechanism of value transfer by which economies around the world are subjected to domination and hegemony by the United States and its partners through the use of sanctions, blockades, and other coercive economic measures designed to extract wealth from targeted populations and render targeted nations impoverished and unable to defend themselves against the political, military, and economic demands and control of imperialism. Of course, at this time, what we're seeing around the world is a tremendous movement forward, challenging those sanctions, not only legally, not only politically, not only through the agitational and organizing work that we see organizations like the Sanctions Kill campaign doing, and research like we see in the production of this book that's being launched here today. But also on a very practical level by countries around the world. The escalation of the use of sanctions, the use of the US dollar as a weapon and as a mechanism of economic control has perhaps never been more clear than it is today. And this is leading to a resurgent interest in de-dollarization and trading without the control and oversight of the US dollar, of US economic and financial institutions, or of their partners in the European Union, Canada, and elsewhere. And one reason for this is because of the tremendous harm that sanctions have done, their role in war, in impoverishment, in the extraction of value from countries, in forced migration, in the destruction of economies, and in regime change is really readily apparent to all. And in many ways, the United States does not even make an effort to hide it anymore. But we see that sanctions are used as a supposedly legal mechanism to engage in the most blatant mechanisms of colonial and imperialist control. And because of that, we also think it's very important to have a legal answer and a legal process of accountability by which the United States and its partners can be held responsible for the tremendous crimes that have been committed and are currently being committed against the peoples of the world. To echo the previous People's Tribunal that was carried out by the civil rights movement and leading Black activists in the United States in the 1950s, once again, we charge genocide. We charge genocide in countries around the world that are systematically targeted on multiple levels through sanctions that affect medicine, health, the environment, the economy, women, development efforts, agriculture, the environment, and essentially all aspects of daily life. The aim of the tribunal is to empower political and popular movements like we see in the Sanctions Kill campaign and in many other organizations doing this kind of important work in order to activate themselves, have arguments at their command, and build their movement stronger and more powerful than ever before. At the same time, it has a legal outcome as well, which is to identify specific causes of action that can be pursued by those who have been victimized and targeted by US sanctions around the world to specifically identify the crimes that have been committed by the United States, as well as the torts that have been committed by the United States against nations and people around the world, and provide suggested causes of action and legal strategies that can be pursued in US and international courts to bring an end to this practice of sanctions, blockades, and coercive economic measures that target the economies of peoples around the world that refuse to bow down to the dictates of imperialism. The tribunal has an expansive schedule of hearings because it looks at the role of these coercive economic measures in establishing control and domination in many areas of the world. Our hearings will focus on Zimbabwe, Korea, Libya, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza and Palestine, Sudan, Iran, Eritrea, Iraq, Yemen, Haiti, Nicaragua, Cuba, Ethiopia, Venezuela, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. Because we see that sanctions are not only a mechanism of pseudo-diplomacy, they're not only a mechanism through which international rivalries are carried out. They're also a direct mechanism of colonialism, they are a mechanism of imperial domination, and they are a mechanism of wealth extraction. We hold this as a people's tribunal because we know that just simply going to court all too often does not provide justice. And a people's tribunal in and of itself cannot compel the state to act in a certain way. But what people's tribunals can do is inspire and provide necessary tools for organizing now and in the future. People's tribunals allow those who have been deprived of power to put the powerful on trial and define the kinds of legal procedures that need to be pursued for real justice, for real accountability, and for a future that is free of imperialism. There's a long tradition of people's tribunals. As we referenced earlier, the We Charge Genocide petition to the United Nations is one of the most well-known people's tribunals of this time that highlighted the fact that US systemic racism and Jim Crow was not only an ongoing series of bad practices, but an institutionalized mechanism of genocide against the Black population that was directly connected to US imperialism internationally. We've also seen the Russell Tribunal and later future Russell Tribunal and the Brussels Tribunal targeting US imperialism in Vietnam, Iraq, and elsewhere. We've seen people's tribunals looking at US involvement in the Philippines and in many other countries around the world. And so through our work, we want to build on this important legacy of anti-imperialist, anti-racist people's tribunals that are also tied to clear legal analyses. This is one reason why we have jurists from around the world who are participating as jurors to put a verdict on the United States for its crimes, to enumerate those crimes clearly, and to identify specific causes of action that can be pursued as one mechanism that comes alongside de-dollarization, that comes alongside political mobilization, that comes alongside the actions of countries that are defying imperialism, mobilizing together. That through all of these streams, through political organizing, through social action, through the leadership and direct involvement of those nations who have been subjected to imperialist domination, sanctions, and warfare, through the legal mechanisms as well, are capable of creating a movement, of creating a political, legal, and academic and discursive framework that can bring US domination, hegemony, and imperialism to an end by stripping away one of its most dangerous and devastating weapons, that of sanctions, blockades, and coercive economic measures. We invite you to learn more about the tribunal at sanctionstribunal.org, and we invite you to join us for our upcoming hearings that will culminate in a closing hearing and plenary, as well as the reading of our initial verdict in Venezuela in July of this year. We'll also be following up with a published document and a book-length analysis of sanctions that builds on much of the work that we see here today, but that also presents new analysis obtained from the unique evidence, documentation, and testimony obtained from scholars, activists, and citizens on the ground who are directly affected on a daily basis by these US imperialist policies and US imperialist crimes. We look forward to a future of working together to create a world free of sanctions, free of blockades, free of coercive economic measures, and finally, free of US imperialism, a world of justice, equality, and human dignity. Thank you for inviting the tribunal to be part of this program today, and we look forward to creating that world together.
So, am I proper?
We're good. We're good for sound, John. Go ahead.
So I'm going to make a few comments about the program and the work we've been doing. We have noted very clearly that sanctions are a form of war, and I'd like to remind us that the Mouvement Québécois pour la Paix supports this event, as does Just Peace Advocates, and there's 4 members of the executive of the Mouvement Québécois pour la Paix present today. And I'd like to make a couple of points, simple points about international law. One country can't tell another country how to organize itself. And when the big countries tell the small countries how to organize themselves, it's intervening in their internal affairs. 26th of June, 1945, the United Nations Charter was adopted to forbid that kind of intervention in the internal affairs. These are things that everybody can understand, and this is a form of war. There's a couple of things that we'd like to say. Some people say, oh, sanctions don't really work. Well, they're not allowed to work. Some people say, you have to intervene militarily because sanctions don't work. They're both wrong. Military intervention is wrong. Sanctions are wrong. Sanctions kill. That's the name of the organization which we work with. And they do kill. They kill slowly and sometimes maybe even worse than military intervention. I'm not going to choose one or the other. We all know here in Canada, Meng Wanzhou, the case of the woman held for 2 years. And get this, how it happened. Just a little thing about law. Where did the US get the jurisdiction to charge? If I kill Sam here, they charge me in Montreal because I committed the crime in Montreal. The US, this was a contract signed by a subsidiary of Huawei with Iran. The US said, well, you can't do it. It's extraterritorial. But they say, oh, but the transaction went through a New York bank. That's how they do it. So we have to be very, very critical of this and go to the heart of the issue. It's all manageable. Alex Saab, diplomat, traveling to Iran as a diplomat of Venezuela to negotiate for food, medicine, and oil products for their refineries. He stopped in Cape Verde, and he was arrested getting off the plane during a routine fuel stop. And the guy spoke to him, so had an American accent. That's a fact, I think. And he was held and tortured until December, and then he was released into house arrest where he could contact nobody. And the local regional court, ECOWAS, ordered him released and ordered him to receive $200,000. And what was it based on? The Interpol red alert came out a day later. It was all planned. All right. So Alex Saab now is in Florida. The immunity claim has been rejected. It's now going on appeal. Some people you can read the Alex Saab judgment and contact me. I can give you the judgment. It's a shame. It's also accessible as a legal document. And so this man is now ill and is having a very difficult time. On the table here, now this is a joke, if you can have a free copy of our sanctions report if you buy the book. No, the sanctions report is there, and three of us, Rick Sterling, David Paul, and myself, wrote the sanctions report, and it gives a good summary. It's different than the book. The book is an analysis, and it's really worth reading. And the other book is kind of a summary, which is pretty much up to date, not fully up to date with Russia and China because things change very quickly. And it's a really, really interesting book. And one point which we make, if I burn this building down today, I have to pay the company or the insurance company damages. If a country hurts another country, one of the prime examples which we know is Cuba, the United States has to pay Cuba damages, reparations. And these are issues which are going to come up because the world is changing fast. They must pay reparations for the damages they have done. Now, we can, there's so many things about Ethiopia right now. They have sanctions policies against Ethiopia. The war is basically settled. There's still a struggle there, but they won. The Ethiopia won their war against the proxy war hit by the United States, and the U.S. is still threatening sanctions on telling them how to organize their country. And what do they use? These are all things. They use the Human Rights Committee to intervene and describe human rights and these are all things which, right, send me an email. I can send you papers of articles about this. They use human rights arguments, including UN organizations, to tell a country what to do and try and demonize a country. Janet Yellen said 3 days ago, I think, sanctions policy is weakening the dollar. Oh, really? We all know that. Should, with respect to, for example, Venezuela made a charge against the US for the sanctions policy because it's caused extensive suffering. Those are crimes against humanity when people suffer a lot. It's US policy. They've sent this up to the ICC, and Karim Khan, the prosecutor who I worked with in the past, is dragging his feet, not doing anything. But in Ukraine, he's running down there to try and lay silly charges against Putin for who took the children out of the war zone. This is the nonsense of the international legal system, of the established legal system. So what we'd like to do now is invite you to ask questions, an exchange. This is our fourth night we've been doing it. Yeah, thank you, Judy. We are going to ask, you could ask a question, make a statement. We're going to limit it to 2 minutes, no crosstalk. And Judy or I will answer your questions, or someone else who knows. I know that there's people here, very educated people in the room who know things, but we'll have the floor is open now. And I'd like to remind people, this is online. So if you speak, you will be identified online. Have I missed anything, Karen? Karen's the master of this webinar.
Yeah, so that's perfect. And for those who are on Zoom, if you can put your questions into the Q&A or even into the chat, Malcolm will get those, or if not, I'll try to follow up behind the scenes. I'm not in Montreal, but we'll get your questions answered. If it's going well, we could try to unmute people, but I'm not sure you're going to hear them well. So I think it's best if people can write their questions into the question and answer for those online.
So, yes.
Do I have to go over there?
No, I think it's
No, you could just speak.
speak.
Okay.
You can speak French too if you want.
That's okay. But ideally, so those who can hear you online could speak into the microphone. That would be good.
Yeah. Well. Good evening, everyone. So my name is Gustavo Monteiro. I'm responsible for the International Solidarity Committee with the Conseil Central de la CSN here in Montreal. My question is, do we have, because I see exactly the initiative with the People's Sanctions Tribunal and everything, which is amazing. We do need that. And I'm just wondering, how can we get like either this kind of content and initiative and other materials like this book that we have right now, and sort of like intervene with the unions, like for the unions like that we have here in Montreal or even like across Canada, to just like apply more pressure on them to sort of like, you know, mobilize their members and also apply some more pressure either on provincial governments, but we're actually looking at the federal government, not really here in the provincial governments really, but more to the Canadian government. So how can we try to like in a few weeks we're gonna have the convention of the labor how do we call it, about the CLC here in Montreal, and then actually in mid-May CSN also we have its convention or congress, and we just had the FTQ just like a few months ago. I just think that like with the labor movement, we could have also, just as we have labor for Palestine and stuff like that, just organize a bit more. So thank you.
I know I can answer that for us in Montreal. We can speak at meetings, and I see 4 people in this room who could all do it. I can see them right here, and we'd be most welcome, most pleased. Nous serons très heureux de venir vous voir, d'avoir une invitation pour parler de ces questions, avoir des échanges, présenter des vidéos, et c'est très important. Et last Wednesday night, there's a union from near Hamilton who adopted a proposition in favor of getting help to Syria under sanction Syria for the terremoto, okay, and the tremblement de terre, okay. So these are things which we can do, and I think we haven't discussed this issue with the Mouvement Québécois pour la Paix. It's within our mandate to raise these issues in a scientific manner because it's a form of war, and we'll discuss how to do it, and we're certainly, I think, well able to attend and speak with unions. It's very important because it comes from the labor union and the workers who, and Sarah pointed out very clearly, it's the workers who can help this. Thank you.
We have one question online. Can you hear me, John? Maybe I'll read that one and then
Yes.
go to one in the room.
I can hear it. Thank you.
Great. What are the sanctions currently in Lebanon that are affecting their banking system and putting a stranglehold on their economy?
I can take that one.
Yes, Judy can take that one. And I'm going to then speak about Canada a bit, which I forgot to mention. Very important.
So what happened in Lebanon is there are sanctioned individuals. There are individuals in Lebanon who have been sanctioned by the US government. And but what really destroyed the Lebanese economy is the fact that they are Syria's banking resource. And Syria does most of its business through Lebanon, through Lebanese import-exports, and through Lebanese banks. And so when the Caesar sanctions were placed on Syria, not allowing them to continue to do that, a large portion of the Lebanese commerce was essentially destroyed. And at the same time that this happened, there is a situation where they were playing sort of some dirty games with interest rates in the banks in Lebanon, so that the banking system there was basically had a Ponzi scheme going. And so a lot of people were putting more and more money in because they were thinking they were getting a lot of interest out of it. And the bank's liquidity was dependent on having that Syrian business because that was the only real business that was going through there. So when the real commerce crashed, there was nothing left except the top of the Ponzi scheme. And of course, that has no value whatsoever. And so a lot of people lost all their money because the bank no longer had any resources because it was blocked through the Syrian sanctions. At the same time, is another kind of sanctions going on in Lebanon, which is that they are sanctioning individuals and mostly people associated with Hezbollah, the organization that in Lebanon is really their most positive supporting aspect of their government right now. Hezbollah does a lot of work for the people. They provide goods and services when no one else can because they're free of sort of certain government restrictions. And so if you sanction the people at the top of the food chain, so to speak, then there'll be things missing. And I can't really give you a good Lebanese example because I'm not that, my understanding is not that detailed, but consider in the United States, like what if they sanctioned Jeff Bezos and took Amazon off the market like one day? So yes, over time, we could accommodate the fact that all this flow of goods and books and things is no longer available. But the day that they did it and the week that they did it and the month that they did it, there would be this big drop in the availability of resources for ordinary people in this country. And they could do it to the person who owns all the Walmarts, the person, you could take that anywhere. It's kind of like what I was saying about China. If you shut out all Chinese goods, we would have a massive hole in our resources. And it affects not the government, not the rich people. It affects you and I when we go out to the store. And that's why this is a real issue for workers, because workers are going to go out to the store and acquire the things that they need for their households, and those things will become unavailable. So that's a story on Lebanon.
There's one thing I didn't mention, and I work with Just Peace Advocates, and Karen is the organizer of this webinar, and we have a lot of people online. And Canada is deeply involved in sanctions. We have the Special Economic Measures Act and have adopted a series of regulations touching Belarus, Burma, Korea, Democratic, Haiti, Iran, Libya, Nicaragua, China, Russia, South Sudan, Sri Lanka, Syria, Ukraine, Venezuela, Zimbabwe. And you can look these all up on Canly. They're all available on Canly. And I've looked at them, looked them over. And so Canada is involved in this. They're not as powerful as the US. Canada has to stop this. Now, I'd like some more questions and comments. I think Greg has a question. Oh, Kim?
Thank you. Kim Gomery with Montreal for World Beyond War. I just have a comment because I was listening to Radio Canada the other day and I heard that an Ollie Mill, one of the most productive Ollie Mill factories where they process pork, was closing, and they were interviewing various workers who were very bewildered and surprised and said that they'd improved their processes. And right away I thought, like, I think I read somewhere that at least 33% of Quebec pork goes to China. And I couldn't help thinking about the war and thinking this must have something to do with the war. But in the whole interview and all the people that they talked to and all the unions, they had the union, none of them brought that up or even seemed to make that connection. And I wondered if you could comment on that when we're talking about unions. Somebody was, unions and I think this is Flounders said something about people don't understand, they don't make the connection, like inflation and all these other things. And
I can't comment. I don't know. That would you know about Ollie Mill?
The original factory basically was, from what I know, it was unionized with the CSN. Workers last year, they organized a strike and they had the gangs. And then this year, the financial group that's responsible for that plant just claimed that, like, financially they're not doing well and they have to close. But that's a strategy to just, because the workers were organized, they had a strike, they had gangs, so they want to shut it down, and maybe 6 months or so they might reopen again. It's actually the same group that shut down another sort of like small sales place, like a co-op as we call here in Quebec, in the region of La Naudière. It's called Co-op Novago. And the workers there were also unionized with CSN. They also were in the process of bargaining. And the same group, they just closed the plant instead of bargaining. So it's just a strategy. And but we didn't hear anything with that that sort of perspective that it just brought up. So it's in like this.
I think Greg has a question. Can you hear, can I be heard from this distance?
I mean, I think it goes there, it's fine. It's less of a question, more of a really quick comment with regards to the anti-sanction work that we have to do here in Canada. In many ways, you already mentioned that Canada is an active sanctioneer, right? Like it actually does its own sanctions, and many times people forget that Canada has its own independent imperialist goals, despite the fact that it's fundamentally integrated with the American projects, right? Especially with NATO, etc. But the prime example is Canada mining corporations in Latin America, for example. And the way the Canadian government utilizes those corporations to, utilizes its own, power, imperialist power to levy sanctions and pressures onto governments which, do not necessarily want to open their markets to the rapacier, bloodthirsty and greedy Canadian corporations. But beyond that, here in Canada, we have the unique element in which there has been a very long-standing propaganda of the government trying to drape itself as a humanitarian and almost better international actor than the United States. And so in many ways, it does not necessarily apply or declares the same sanctions as the US, but it respects them fundamentally, and it does not bring them up at all. So you've got a lot of people being like, oh, well, Canada does not sanction this or that country, or does not do this or that. For example, Canada does not actively enforce the embargo in Cuba. However, the fact of the matter is, by being so integrated fundamentally with the imperialist American project, and by having the Canadian economy being so fundamentally intertwined with American capital, the Canadian imperialist and bourgeois class in general does not necessarily see a problem in respecting all those sanctions, right? And it's not worse making life hell for groups in Canada that actually do actively try to provide help in specific countries. And again, by that, I mean, for example, Cuba, right? Like here we have a relatively active Cuba solidarity group, but the hoops to which we have to jump in order to be able to send a container, for example, to Cuba of medical goods, etc., despite the fact that Canada, technically speaking, does not see an inherent problem with that, it is an issue, because in the end, we've got all our corporations abiding by those sanctions without a single question. And in the end, there's also the question of sovereignty. In many ways, Canada and Quebec do not have a sovereign imperialist, a sovereign foreign policy, because it follows American hegemonic lines with regards to economy. So I think it's important in the struggle here, just to finish my comment, to never forget that many people forget that we actually abide by sanctions, and to bring them up, even though the Canadian government does not necessarily apply those sanctions. And it's an inherent part of our work with regards to Cuba, for example. So I'll stop there.
Well, I fully agree with you, and thank you, Greg, for this. It's not only Canadian sanctions, it's Canadian respect for US sanctions, and Canadian policy with respect to China is very important, and it can hurt Canada if they follow the US, because Canada has a lot of things China would like, and they can have a proper relationship with China, a proper economic relations, which will benefit workers in Quebec and the population of Canada, of Quebec and Canada, of course. So I fully agree with that, and any work we do on this will have to relate to not just Canadian sanctions, but Canadian respecting US sanctions on Syria, also on Korea. And so that's a really important point. Do you have any more questions?
Well, I have a brief comment after just following on what John just said, which is if Canadians want to know what happens when you slavishly follow US policies, they could take a look at Germany and France and Poland and Finland, which now has nuclear weapons lined up on its border.
Do we have any more questions?
We have one question from online, if I could ask it. It's from somebody anonymous, and they said they wondered if the presenters might comment on this. If the usual rationale for coercive economic measures is abuse of human rights in various countries, how come no Western sanctions are ever labeled against countries with dismal human rights records such as Saudi Arabia or Israel, and I would add India to that because of India's military occupation of Kashmir and domicile law there.
Well, sanctions, as in the US, as in Europe, and as in Canada, are the exercise of foreign policy priorities, often related to weakening or overturning a government. I don't like the term regime because I like the term government. Using the word regime implies illegitimacy. However, Canada, it's an exercise of Canadian foreign policy, and therefore Canada is slavishly in support of Israel. Canada is pretty friendly to Saudi Arabia. Let's see what happens in the next little while, because there may be a change, and there may be a change. With respect to India, I don't know the details, but clearly the Kashmir problem should be, Canada should make a lot of pressure on the Kashmir problem, which is similar, as we know, and as Karen knows much more than I do, about similar to the problem of Palestine. So that's the answer, Karen. It's not a complete answer to the anonymous person, but
I could add something to that. First of all, Kashmir is disputed between India and Pakistan. It was, at the time of independence, allowed to not be affiliated with either one, but that didn't last very long. But it was one of the Indian states, the same as with Pakistan and India. So I think there's a sense of people wanting to stand back. But beyond that, the overall issue here is that human rights has nothing to do with the reason for application of sanctions. It's an excuse. It's calling poison medicine. And they're doing it on purpose because that's a good way to poison people or to poison other countries. So whenever you hear that it has something to do with human rights, immediately, whoever's listening to this, in your mind, turn that over, because sanctions violate the rights of civilians in every country where they're applied. It doesn't matter what, even the ones with the worst governments, and most of the countries under sanctions have better governments than the ones surrounding that are not sanctioned. So it's very much cut and dried. Human rights is not the reason why sanctions are implied ever. So in Israel, there's an internal boycott like there was in South Africa. And it may extend a little bit into the world, but primarily it was initiated internally. And that is a completely different story than sanctions as we know them, than coercive sanctions. And so I don't really think it's comparable. Thank you.
so Karen, do you have anybody else?
I don't believe there is anybody else. There's been some comments, but I think we have answered the questions that are online. If anybody else does have questions, though, you can still put them in. Are there more questions from the room, John?
I think, yes, Gustavo. And you can come in so we can all hear it from here.
Yeah. Here, come and stand by the microphone.
Yeah, just a second question. Sorry, everybody online. Sorry, little bit of earthquake here in Montreal. Just a quick question, actually, how you see, for example, now what's happening in Mexico, where now Obrador wants to nationalize some part of like the energy sector in the country. And of course, Canada and US, they have the NAFTA. So how are they going to handle this situation? Of course, we know there's going to be pressure for the Mexican government to not do that, lobby and all kinds of other tools to sort of like, you know, not allow this to happen. But at the same time, in the context of the Americas, we see some sort of like a more careful but similar movement with Lula in Brazil, which is trying to, of course, with the pressure of social movements, labor movement and everything, to nationalize again some companies that were privatized since the coup d'etat in 2016. And funny enough, but during Bolsonaro's government, we didn't see any call for sanctions in Brazil or anything about human rights, even though there was a genocide and things like that. So how do we see this context in within the Americas, in the same time where you have center like social democrat governments with the pressure of social movements trying to nationalize important sectors like the energy sectors, but in the same time the US government and Canada comes with them, sort of trying to influence these governments to support in the sanctions on Russia and China, countries that have really close ties with most countries in South America and Latin America in general. So
I'll be very brief because this is not something I have studied, and I will make some possibilities. All right. One, Mexico is, there's a risk of an invasion of Mexico right now, allegedly over narco traffic. I don't believe it, but I'm not an expert and someone can contradict me, but it's not the first time the US has invaded Mexico. How many times? I don't know how many times. All right. How many times has US overthrown governments in Latin America? The Monroe Doctrine is not dead. Lula, I don't want to get too much into Lula because there's a lot of debate about his policies, and I'm not gonna, it's not a time for us to have a chat about that. However, we do note that he's de-dollarizing with China, which is a very important thing. I won't comment on the internal policies because I don't talk about things I don't know about, all right? But there's a big risk of problems there. So the Monroe Doctrine is not dead. And we've got to remember, Nicaragua is under tremendous pressure. Canada has a policy on Nicaragua, and they're trying to overthrow the government, which is succeeding rather well. The intensification on Venezuela, apparently, from what I understand, there's more lineups for gas now. It's very serious in Venezuela. I'm not an expert, but we have a friend, William, who's there. So I can't go any farther than that to your question, but it's very relevant.
I think that I can say something a little further, which is that I think this is the first time that there's been the United States is inviting a real risk to our own country, because up till now, in every war that's happened, the United States has been alone on the Western continent. And there hasn't been any real access for any other country. All these wars have taken place in Europe, in China, and in the Pacific, all of them far away from the United States. But right now, China and Russia are making inroads in Venezuela, in the most sanctioned countries initially, like Venezuela and Nicaragua. And they're looking for ways, they're looking at possibility of putting a replacement for the Panama Canal, or competition, shall we call it, for the Panama Canal through Nicaragua. They're looking at possibly selling weapons to countries in Latin America, which would lead to having their trainers on the ground there. Iran is working closely with Venezuela to so that both of them can export their oil, because they have complementary resources. And so should the United States start a war, a global war, we will have a much higher risk of retaliation than we have ever had in the course of the last, I don't know, 1,000 years. Because up till now, the Monroe Doctrine has kept the Western Hemisphere under the control of the United States. But because of their oppression, I mean, the sad thing, in a way, maybe it's a good thing because it'll set them free, but they've done this to themselves. I say they, meaning our government, your government, and Canada, and mine in the United States. They've done this to themselves because they push these countries so their backs are to the wall. And otherwise they would not have taken the risk of moving away the way they're doing. But it's a very risky thing. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens.
I just noticed a comment by, I guess it's by Karen Rodman, and it's been on my mind, and very good to talk to the flight of Masaya. You guys heard about that?
Comment on it myself. I know about it, but if you want to make a short comment, I'd like to close in a minute and invite you to buy some books, but
Very shocking and sad news today. Hassan Diab is the professor in Ontario who was extradited to Paris to face charges for the bombing of a synagogue in the 1980s.
Oh.
And even though he was in Lebanon at the time and the fingerprints didn't match and all of the evidence was thrown out of court again and again and again by 15 different judges, I think in France, they kept him for 3 years imprisoned away from his family, and Canada allowed him to be extradited. Anyway, he was finally moved back a few years ago to Canada, and personally, I thought it was all done. I mean, I still was getting the, the notifications about we have to change our extradition laws, but they actually tried him in absentia today, and he found him guilty in a kangaroo court. And now there's a danger of him being extradited again, because Canada's laws are very remiss in that. Him being extradited again to Paris. And when I looked this up years ago when I first heard about it. And if you look in the newspapers from that time in Paris, the first fingers were pointed to right-wing extremist groups. He said all this bombing from the Jewish synagogue probably was right-wing extremists. And then they just did a about force. And suddenly it was some Muslim guy, a professor in Ontario. It's so ridiculous. And it's such a racial profiling, horrible miscarriage of justice, and it's happening in Canada is complicit. So anyway, I know that's off topic for today, but it's been on my mind all day because I was astounded. I'm sorry that I didn't take it more seriously because I never believed that he would be found guilty in any court.
Well, in absentia.
Yeah, a kangaroo court. Yeah.
I'd like to, thank you very much for the comment on SNDF. I'd like to close now. And I'm speaking also to the
John,
people online who I don't know, but who Karen Rodman knows, and to say to you that Sanctions Kill and its friends are able to collaborate with different organizations to talk about sanctions. It has to become a live issue in Canadian politics. NDP, a Bloc, Québécois, all the parties, in fact, have to be alerted to sanctions. We have to alert our country to the importance of not sanctioning China, and we have to struggle. I'd like to invite you to, and I'm joking again, you can take a sanctions report and buy the book for $20, but you can, whatever you like. The book is actually worth, there's got lots of stuff in the book. I have an article in the book, but it's got a mistake. I found a mistake in what Ann Garrison and I signed.
Well, I would like to just say that with the books, I want to talk about the books. So I'm the design editor of the book, and so I'm sort of point person for the books. But because this is a first edition, and we're currently, just for the moment, out of the second editions, we're happy to provide people who purchase this first edition of the book with an EPUB of the second edition, so that you can read the 3 additional articles and all the wonderful quotes saying how great we are in the second edition. So I hope you will have a sign-up sheet. You could just put your email address on it and your name, and I'll be happy to send you an EPUB to go with your book. And I thank you very much.
And thank you for our Karen and Malcolm for this very professional webinar, which is hybrid. It's nice to be out of COVID so we can touch our colleagues. It's also nice to be online with serious people that Karen's been working with for years.
And I have an offer before we finish. The books are on sale at iacenter.org. And you can go to iacenter.org and you can order a copy. We're the latest batch of the second edition is currently at the printers, and we should have them within a couple of weeks. So that's another option, and especially for the people online. There's also access to the EPUB on iacenter.org. Thank you.
thanks to everyone. And we will get the copy of the video out to people after. So thanks everyone for joining, and have a good weekend for online. Bye-bye, everyone.
Can everybody see Karen?
I know they can actually. Do you want me to come on? I can come on. There I am.
Karen is the Just Peace Advocates and the very formidable organization with a lot of contacts and we'll collaborate with many of these types of actions in the future.
That's great. We have some interesting Cuba too, so we'll bring that in for the next time. So
Yeah.
thanks, everyone. Have a good time in Montreal, and everybody online. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.